I call Simon O'Connor.
Mr Speaker, it's becoming quite a habit to follow after the Honourable Annette King. But look, I'm particularly pleased that Labor and I believe all parties are supporting this in the House. The Radiation Safety Bill, today in its third reading, is a relatively simple piece of legislation by its nature, but complex in its details. I say it's relatively simple because as a piece of legislation it really is here to do two things. One is to sort of just update the domestic regulations and structures, operations, logistical elements, if you will, of how we deal with radiation, and we'll come to the whole ionising, non-ionising element in a moment. But there's the domestic side, which the bill seeks to update, and then there's the international side. And if I just touch on that quickly and briefly, New Zealand, in so many ways, is obliged or has chosen to oblige itself of a variety of international agreements on a whole lot of things, and one of them is around the likes of radiation and the management of radiation. And so, as has been pointed out by other speakers in this debate and in the past, the current Radiation Safety Act, or as it's known actually, the Radiation Protection Act, was done in 1965, and so what treaties were about then, things have changed. So this bill brings us into line with international agreements. It's something that we as a parliament required to do, if you will, if we're going to maintain those relationships. Importantly to it, it means that we will accord ourselves to the various principles of the agencies. Some of them are monitored through the UN. So that's quite important. I will just state for the record, this does not affect the nuclear-free legislation of New Zealand or any of the disarmament acts. It sometimes gets raised with me and others, but look, this bill is dealing with ionising radiation, and by that, what we're talking about, think of the likes of MRIs, think of X-rays. That's the sort of area that we're talking about. And we're also talking a lot of things medical. Most radiation sources in New Zealand are down two sides, or two camps. One is research. So if you go into any of the universities of New Zealand, there'll be radiation sources often used in the science departments and the medical departments. The second area where you'll find a lot of devices, and I think there's about 4,500 licences, in other words, 4,500 instances where radiation sources are able to be used. The other big player, bar research, is medical. So obviously the scanning technologies, but often for the treatment of various cancers. So brachytherapy comes to mind, ionised or radiated metal balls which are used in order to destroy cancers. You've got ionised iodine, at times often for the likes of thyroid cancers and so forth. So that's what we're talking about there. There's been plenty of debate, and some part of me, a very small part of me, will miss the constant discussions in Select Committee between ionising and non-ionising radiation. None of us are nuclear physicists, but I have to say after all those discussions I feel far more comfortable about the distinction now. But it is only somewhat tongue-in-cheek that I say that I will miss those ongoing discussions. Look, I'm not going to get into the science of it, but needless to say, with the advice that we're given, and to which I think all members understand, the distinction is very, very clear between things, and also in the nature of the examples that are given. We heard it from the previous speaker, you know, the likes of non-ionising radiation. We're talking the likes of sunbeds and Wi-Fi and power poles and so forth. Okay, it's quite a distinct difference between the radiating of metal objects like brachytherapy and so on. So we understand why, and I think it's important for people to understand out there as well that just because this bill doesn't cover the likes of power lines and Wi-Fi and the like, doesn't mean there are not regulations and guidance around it. There's plenty of that through other legislative measures. So look, that's quite positive in and of itself. The committee itself, I think, was very constructive. I think we realised very early on we were at one level out of our depth here in the scientific knowledge. But one of the great things about select committees is that we actually got 2 ears, 2 eyes and 1 mouth, and we used those, I think, exceedingly well to listen, see and speak to the officials. So once again, I want to acknowledge their work and advice, and speaking personally for actually taking sometimes very complex ideas and bringing them down into a way that I could understand, and I think help us as a committee move forward. I think it was very collegial what we've done, and again, as previous speakers have indicated, to bring back a very good bill into this House. Just in concluding, because we've spoken on this many, many times, I just want to touch on a few of the changes that the Select Committee brought forward. Look, one really important one, it's particularly users in medical fields, dental and otherwise. We put in a new clause to say that basically if someone's got a licence, they can have someone else work under their supervision. Okay, there's a few nuances around that, but basically, if I was to read it, an unlicensed user can use a radiation source while they're under direct supervision of someone else. So again, licenses, Mr. Speaker, must be given to someone who's going to use the radiation source. So think again, ionised iodine, brachytherapy treatments. As long as the source user and the holder of the licence is given permission, then someone else is able to be guided through that process. For those military-minded, be absolutely assured that the legislation as proposed here at third reading does not prejudice the rights of national security and therefore of our defence forces. Okay, there's other rules which assist there. Also importantly, initially in the bill we just talked about enforcement officers. We did go through that quite carefully to make sure that people understood that the likes of the police, chief fire officers and others can have some jurisdiction in this space if something was to go wrong. And finally, Mr. Speaker, the importance of codes of practices has been written into the bill, and that links me back to where I started, which is the whole thing of this is updating our international obligations, and in doing so we're able to tap into international best practice which informs our codes of practice. So this is a good bill. It's been worked on very well by the committee. I think we can be very happy with the progress of this bill, and I commend it to the House, title and all.